only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Communicating with Your Kids, Sexuality and Developmental Disability. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to let you know a little bit about Family Voices of California. We're a statewide coalition of locally based parent-run centers working to ensure children and youth with special health care needs receive quality health care. As the state affiliate of National Family Voices, we're California's federally funded family-to-family health information center, and we provide statewide support to families of children with special needs. These webinars serve as statewide trainings on various child health topics and are geared toward families, professionals, and parent-to-parent resource staff and advocates. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can go ahead and call GoToWebinar directly at the number on the screen. Due to feedback issues, we have everyone on mute from our end. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to type in any questions that you have for our presenter today in the appropriate box on the right-hand side of your menu. We'll stop periodically to address some questions and also save time at the end for any additional questions you may have. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the Family Voices website along with the accompanying PowerPoints. Afterward, you'll be emailed a very short evaluation survey, and we thank you in advance for providing your invaluable feedback about today's webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce our wonderful speaker, Katherine McLaughlin. Katherine's been an expert on sexuality and developmental disabilities for over 25 years. She teaches sexuality education to people with disabilities and trains them to be peer sexuality educators. Katherine's the author of an agency and school curriculum, Sexuality Education for People with Developmental Disabilities, and has developed 2 online courses, one to train professionals and one for parents. I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation to Katherine now. Thank you so much.
Great. Can you see the screen, Sarah?
I'm still changing it. 1 second. There we go.
Show my screen?
Yes.
Okay, got it. All right, great. So thank you all for attending this webinar today. It's great to know that there's lots of people interested in this topic. And I've been told that there's some people from Canada on this webinar, and people outside of California as well are joining this webinar. So thank you all for being here. And as was mentioned, I'm going to talk for a little while, and then I may pose a question to you and have you, type some things into the chat box. And we're actually going to try to do a poll at some point as well. So trying to make this webinar a little bit interactive, which can be hard to do with a webinar. But really what my work has been is that I've noticed over the years that when I first started doing this work, people said, oh, please come to my agency, come to my school, talk to the students, talk to the people with developmental disabilities. And now I'm finding that more people are interested in taking on the topic themselves, but they just need a little support in how to do that. And this is sort of an example of that, of parents really wanting to try to talk to their children about sexuality. But we live in a culture that doesn't do that very well, and there aren't a lot of role models for us around how to do that. So I think it's good news to see the progress where people want to address this issue more than they have in the past. So that's good news. So when we think about, for some reason my, there we go. Okay, the slide moved. Sorry about that. What I've done too is I've asked people with developmental disabilities, why do you need sexuality education, or why do you, what's important about it as far as, I'm just trying to move this screen out of the way. Okay, what do you need and want to learn about sexuality? So why do people want this? So I asked self-advocates these questions, and they had some great responses. So So we can learn to have healthy relationships. So we aren't lonely. So we're able to make informed choices. So we can pick the right person. For help with the toughest part of the relationship, making it last. So we can be safe, because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay. All right, my thing is not moving. Oh, wait a second. Okay, sorry everyone. I don't know, I'm having some technical difficulties. I'll use the arrow on the bottom. So some other things that they say is to get correct information, to get resources and tools to make healthy choices so that people know their rights, so people with disabilities don't put themselves in bad situations, know how to protect ourselves, so we can feel good about ourselves and our bodies, so we can be sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. And many people with disabilities say that as far as the self-advocacy movement, it has been really wonderful for them to be able to speak up and say, I'd like to get a job, or I'd like to get my own apartment, or ask for what they want and need. But they say it's harder to be a sexual self-advocate for all kinds of reasons, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But as far as sexual self-advocacy, this is the definition that a group of self-advocates from Green Mountain Self-Advocacy in Vermont created. So speaking up for yourself sexually, getting information, taking a stand, saying to whomever, this is my choice, stating your sexual limits with your partner, respecting others' limits, starting to do what you want with relationships. So it's not just, it's about speaking up about wanting a relationship or to be in a relationship, but also within the relationship. How do you speak up for what you need and want, and also respect others' needs and wants? So that's sexual self-advocacy, and that's really the focus. And a lot of my work is around helping parents talk with their children about becoming sexual self-advocates, how to help staff talk to people with disabilities about this topic. And the curriculum that was mentioned by Sarah, the focus is sexual self-advocacy. So how do you learn to speak up and advocate for yourself? So the plan for the next hour or so is for you to gain some knowledge on sexuality and developmental disabilities. And you're also going to acquire and, maybe practice a little bit of communicating about sexuality with your young and grown children. Again, it's a little hard to be interactive on a webinar, but we'll see what we can do. And then just to make sure you're clear on what sexuality is, oftentimes when people hear sexuality, they think sex or intercourse, and it means more than that. It's a much broader definition. So oftentimes when people hear sexuality education, they think that it means we're talking about how to have sex, and that's a piece of it, but that's not all of it. So really the definition is much broader. So it's about intimacy, connection, and belonging. It's about relationships, friendships, as well as sexual relationships or romantic relationships. It's about how we feel about being the gender that we are, how we feel about ourselves and others. It is about sexual expression and behavior, but really it's the total of who we are, what we believe, what we feel, and how we respond. So it's much, like I said, much broader than this idea of sex or intercourse when we talk about sexuality. So some places we'll talk more about relationship education because it doesn't have as much of a charge, relationship, as sexuality does. But we're going to be talking about sexuality, this broader definition. So what I want to ask you, and here's the participating part, and Sarah's going to collect your responses, but really, what would you say the primary message was that you received growing up about sexuality from your own parents, whether it was your mother or your father or another adult that was really a primary caretaker for you? What was the primary message that you received? So if you could yeah.
Should I launch the poll or?
Nope, not yet.
Okay.
So we're going to have you just write in the chat first, and then we'll do the poll afterwards. So write down some of the messages you received about sexuality growing up. And then Sarah, you'll give us a little summary of some of the messages.
Perfect. They're rolling in already.
Great.
That we didn't talk about it. It has to be, quote, normal. Don't do it. It's okay and normal to have new feelings about yourself and other people. Nothing. It wasn't discussed. For marriage, a lot of no discussion at all, taboo. Don't talk about it. I don't want to get pregnant. It's a secret and something to be embarrassed about, or it's private. Girls are the gatekeepers to sex. People with DD cannot and do not have sex. Dangerous, messy, not allowed. Nothing in Asian culture. Parents will never talk about sexuality. Sinful. It has to be for adults. It's disgusting. Didn't talk much with family. A lot of the didn't talk about it at all, or saving for marriage themes coming in here. Why buy the cow if you can get the milk for free? It's a good thing. They just keep flowing in. There's a lot in here right now, but I think I hit on some of the major themes that people were sharing.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I think with what I heard was there were some things about culture in there. Someone said in the Asian culture, no one talks about it. I heard things like sinful, disgusting, a lot of don't talk, but then I did hear some positive messages as well. And now what we're going to do now is just do a poll. And all you have to do is vote on whether the messages that you got, you feel like were primarily negative messages, like don't talk about it, that sort of thing, or were primarily positive messages. So if you could all take that poll, we're going to see how many, sort of the percentage of how many people felt like they actually got some positive messages versus negative messages. So I think, Sarah, we're going to give them a little bit of time to fill that out.
Yep. Responses are coming in already.
Great.
Here. Looks like they got it. Perfect.
Are they still coming in, Sarah?
Yep, it looks like it's about 26% received positive messages and 74 negative.
Great. All right. Thank you all for doing that. And again, I started off with the good news that people want to address it. And really, when I used to do these workshops and I would say, raise your hand if you feel like you got positive messages about sexuality, I might have one person in a group of 30 or 40 people. So it does seem to me like things are changing. And 26% positive, although it sounds low, it's actually moving in the right direction. And that we aren't dealing with this topic in the same way that we used to, in a more negative way. Lots of people say that because no one talked to them, they've turned around and want to talk to their own children because they did feel lost and got the message, don't talk about it. And so many people have turned that around and said, I'm going to talk about it. So thank you for doing that. And the next piece is more about people with disabilities. And a few of those were mentioned when we were talking about the messages. So people with disabilities tell me the messages they get are, you are not a sexual being. So recently when I was in Minnesota, there was a self-advocate in one of my trainings who said that when she was in high school, she was taking health class, the mainstream health class. She was in the class, and when the sexuality unit came, she was removed from the classroom. So the message she got from that is, you're not a sexual being and you don't need this information. And that was probably 5 or 6 years ago that happened. So that's pretty alarming that someone's in a class and they're actually taken out of the class. So the message is really clear. You're not a sexual being. Another message they say they get is you should not have sex. You're innocent and childlike and need protection from sexuality. You're not responsible. You cannot solve problems. You're unable to make good decisions. You always make mistakes. Would not make good parents, so should not have children. And they also say that the messages they get are often very different than what their non-disabled siblings got. And many people, when they talk about messages they got, sometimes by gender they feel it's different, like their brother got a different message than they did as a female, or if someone has a disability, that parents give different messages to the non-disabled siblings. So people are paying attention and they know these are the kind of messages that are coming towards them. And so really my first tip to people is to really think about the messages that you're giving to your children. And I know there's some professionals that are on this call as well. If you're working with people with disabilities, to give positive messages, but also help parents give positive messages about sexuality, because we are in this culture where we can be pretty negative about it. So that's the first tip, is really just thinking, what's the message I want to give right now when this question comes up or when this behavior happens? What's the message I want to give? And I was mentioning earlier to Sarah and Pip, who organized this, that I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old. They do not have disabilities. And I'm always thinking, what's the message that I want to give? So think about that as kind of the beginning. Am I giving positive messages? And if my child is in a workshop 20 years from now and they're asked, what was the primary message you got about sexuality? What will they say? And think about that. All right, so I've changed the slide to human sexual development. And what I'm going to do here is really just talk about just a brief overview of human sexual development. And then we're going to explore a little bit with what do we think is the same for someone with a disability and what do we think is different. So similar to messages, people had certain messages, and then people with disabilities have those messages plus more. So what's the same and what's different? So briefly, the human sexual development, there are these many sort of tasks that people go through as they develop. And the first piece is the development of biological sex. So this is really what your sexual organs look like, or your genitals look like, right? And so you're born with certain genitals. And when a baby's born, the doctor, the midwife, or whoever's at the birth looks at the sex of the baby, the biology, and from that assigns a gender. And we're in a culture that has really two genders, right? We have males and females, or feminine and masculine gender. Some other cultures have other types of gender, but in ours it's pretty much those two, right? So we assign one of those two. And then as a child develops, around age 3, they start to form their gender identity. So we'll just say a baby girl is born, we look at the biology, we see a vulva on the outside of her body, we assign female, and then around age 3, typically what happens is she'll say, I'm a girl. And as you know, and as we've learned more and more in our culture, that doesn't always work for everybody. Some people's gender identity doesn't match their biology, right? So we're learning more and more about that. So early on is when gender identity really develops. And it also what happens is our societal gender roles. So we're learning about, okay, if I'm a girl, this is how I'm supposed to act, this is how I'm supposed to look. If I'm a boy, this is what I'm supposed to do. And we start to get sort of the gender rules. So we learn how to do gender in our culture. And that is something that is culturally defined, right? So you could be in another country and males might all knit or something like that. Where in our country that it tends to be more females who knit. So we have these different rules. And what we know about them is that they can change because they're not true for every country, right? So they're defined by our society. So young people start to learn gender roles. And then there's the development of values and attitudes about sexuality. And this happens young. We often think that, oh, if my kid takes sexuality education class in high school, they're going to learn values. They've gotten your values early on in life, usually 7 or 8 or 9, they start to really explore values, and how you respond to them gives them your values, lets them know what you think and what you believe about certain topics. So it's not something that comes later on, although our values might change. And as a parent, it's really important to give your values. And like I said earlier, there are some professionals on the webinar. And for them, it's really important not to give your values, but to help the person you're supporting figure out what their values are. But as a parent, that's your job, that's your role, is to give values. Now, they don't always listen to our values, but it's still our job to give them, right? So then we move into puberty. And I'm sure we can all remember puberty. So the physical and emotional changes where we start to change from really a child to an adult. So there's lots of, I'm going to go through some topics too around puberty. But one of the things that also happens is the development of one's sexual orientation. So this is when somebody discovers, what their feelings are about other people. And it can be divided into 3 different categories. It can be, who are you affectionately attracted to? So who do you like? Who are your friends? It can be romantic attraction. Who do you love? Who do you fall in love with? And then your erotic attraction. So who do you lust after? So really, it's not just lust, which we often think of when we think of sexual orientation, but it's like, love, and lust are sort of the 3 areas of one's sexual orientation. In general, the statistics say that about 1 in 10 people are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And so that might be something that is an issue for your child and you're talking to them about sexual orientation. So the sexual orientation are the feelings. And just like lots of people, when they went through puberty, the year before, they were with this person and they thought, oh, I can't stand them. And then the next year they come back to school and they're in like 7th grade and they've got this big crush on the person. Those feelings just happen. It's not anything that we can control. And so it's very similar for anyone that all of a sudden you have these feelings. So that's sexual orientation. Then the development of sexual behavior. So then you act on those feelings potentially, or you don't. But that's the development of sexual behavior. So people might start to kiss or hold hands as sort of the beginning of sexual behavior. And it can go to lots of other sexual behaviors. So you've got the orientation of the feelings, the behaviors, and then the development of sexual identity. And this is how the person identifies. So they might say, I am heterosexual, I'm homosexual, I'm bisexual. There's lots of different identities, sexual identities that people identify with. And that's something that they sort out for themselves, and they decide what their sexual identity is. And then we move into just, continuing on with the development of sexual knowledge and the development of sexual skills. And that's lifelong learning, where we've gotten through puberty, and now we're going to just learn more about sexuality as we age, get better, get more skilled as a sexual person. So that's kind of a brief overview of human sexual development. And then I'm just going to show you a few different topics that are in these certain age groups. And then I'm going to open it up for you talk about what's the same and different. So just briefly, again, I'm just going to show you young children. So I'm showing you this for a couple reasons, that there's a lot that goes on with young children around sexual development. But also, I often will use this as sort of a checklist too. So if I'm working with someone with a disability, I might think, okay, do they know the body parts and functions? Do they know about genital touching? Do they know about reproduction? As sort of thinking about what people need to know about at what age. So here are the different topics that young kids ask about and have concerns about. And oftentimes, this issue about the need for privacy increases. Sometimes that's something that we have to teach young people with disabilities, or older people too, around privacy. So some of these things that kind of might sort of naturally unfold for young children may have to be taught later on for someone with a disability. So we've got those topics, and then we move into adolescence. And so we've got the changes of puberty, which I mentioned, and not only just the body changes, but also pimples and body odor, like all of these things start to change because of sweat glands, and the hormones in your body start to change things. They also have concerns about friendships. If one friend is developing before another friend, it can strain the relationship. So there's lots going on around friendships during adolescence. There's lots of questions about reproduction and pregnancy and birth and different pregnancy options. If we're thinking about younger adolescents, it's more about wondering about these things and learning about these things, where older adolescents, it might be more relevant to their lives, depending on how they're developing sexually. Sexual expression is another topic that they're very interested in, contraception and sexually transmitted infections. But one of the things that we often don't talk about is this term sexual feelings. So that's something that young people, like I said earlier, start to experience. And so talking about them as a normal part of growing up is a positive, healthy message to give. Masturbation is another topic that comes up, or there's some questions about for adolescents. And also sexual orientation and gender identity as well are topics that might be of concern, or for themselves personally, or just learning about the topic. Body image, relationships, and breaking up. So there's lots to talk about, and the thought of talking to your kids about sexuality and having to cover all these topics can be a little overwhelming. But if we look at adults, it doesn't end after adolescence, and adolescence is kind of keeps getting longer and longer these days. But even adults have questions about pregnancy, right, and birth and parenting and sexually transmitted infections and contraception, masturbation, sexual orientation and gender identity. So very, can be similar topics than adolescence. Relationships, separation and divorce, body image, menopause, or for men it's andropause, and changes in sexual functioning, right? So you're getting older and things are changing, and those can be concerns of adults as well. So that was a lot of information. But if you could use the chat again, and Sarah will give us a little bit of a summary like she did before. We'll start with the first question. How is a person with a developmental disability's experience of developing the same as someone without a disability? Like, what do you think is the same for people with disabilities regarding human sexual development? So if you could start putting some of your thoughts in there, what's the same? And then we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about different afterwards. Are some things coming in, Sarah? Whoops.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, things are coming on in. Puberty, sexual feelings, changes in the body are the same. Desire for intimacy, same. Language impairment may make it more difficult to talk about. Let's see here. Their bodies are changing at the same time as their chronologically aged peers. Romantic interest, physical puberty, changes in relationships are the same. Feelings, biological changes are the same. Sometimes the bodies develop at the same or slightly slower pace as far as puberty. Physical impairment may make it more difficult to act on sexual feelings. Bodies don't ask permission to develop. For people who don't communicate traditionally, it can be hard to have conversations about sexuality. Same messages from media. Interest in sex and sexuality are the same. Same desires and needs. Biological are the same. Communication is tricky to understand cues from parents and potential partners. Romantic interest impacted by media, a couple of those notes. I think what is the same is the changes and wanting to be loved. Same affection, wanting to be touched and be touched, frustration with expressing feelings, different, harder to understand or express sexuality. Chronological age and neurological age can be different. They're not able to process or understand as well. Yeah, I think that's a good selection. They've kind of slowed down so far, but
yeah, excellent. So so there's lots of different things that are the same. I heard a lot of issues around feelings being the same, desires, wants, biology being the same, and I have a list here, which I think you mentioned most of these here. I mean, the assigned gender is the same, right? Gender roles are reinforced. No matter whether someone has a disability or not. Biological changes are the same. Need the same information based on biological age. So often I heard a couple, like maybe the cognitive age is different than the biological age. And what we really want to focus on is the biological age, and then how you teach it, how you communicate would be different, but the topics themselves would be the same. And then they have sexual feelings and needs, like you mentioned, and have dreams like anyone else. Someone said to be loved, and can't remember what else it was. But yeah, so a lot is the same. So if you can take a minute and just say, well, what's different? And I heard a few differences earlier, like around language might make it a little different in how you teach and communicate. But what's different for someone with a disability around sexual development? So if you can start putting some of those in the chat, that would be great.
So due to cognitive development, a person with an intellectual disability may stop at a certain sexual age and not move on. Levels of understanding, awareness on privacy, ability to read emotion and body language, understanding the reality of crushes. The main difference I see is how parents and caretakers deal with this topic. Understanding risk and consequence, level of independence has shown up a couple of times, as has communication and understanding, ability to date casually or experiment sexually, the way they express feelings to another person, late bloomers, relational identity may be different due to various social cues taken from family and media. More naive with peers, easier to be taken advantage of, knowing where to draw the line and when to hide and when to show feelings, unable to appropriately make their needs or desires known. Cognitive age is different, available or interested in potential partners may be different, less able to discern and interpret body language and nonverbal cues. Risk-taking behavior isn't allowed. And a few of these comments have mentioned that the sound is bad, so I will try to fix that real quick on my mic. Let's see if that's any better. Understanding good and bad touches, an ability to understand Appropriate touching, once again, has shown up a few times, between family and friends, community members, and personal space. Yeah, there's a couple more, but I think that was a good.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
No problem.
And thank you all for contributing to the chat. So some of the things that I heard, and I have a list here as well, is that people don't discuss the topic with them. We'll often think of them as oversexed. And so sort of make this assumption that if somebody's being sexual in a park in the bushes, that they couldn't even wait to get home, but it could be that they don't have any privacy at home. And I heard that as well about privacy. Much higher rate of abuse, which has been mentioned as well. And different studies say different numbers, but it is a big issue for people with disabilities. Oftentimes behaviors are accepted or forgiven. So someone with a disability who's 17 and does something and we say, oh, that's all right, they didn't mean anything by it. Where if it was someone without a disability that same age, we would have a really strong reaction. So we often excuse behaviors. So that's really different. So the messages that we're getting can often lack friendships or social opportunities to learn how to be in relationships with people, maybe somewhat isolated or lonely as well. So that can be really different. And I did hear people say something about body language and picking up on social cues. So due to the nature of the disability, may not be good at picking up on those cues. And also, like I mentioned before, how you teach the topic is different. Not what topics need to be taught, but how you do it is a little bit different. Often lack privacy to explore their sexuality, so often have a lot of people paying attention to them and being around and not having a lot of time to explore. And some parents have said to me that when they had their child and were told that their child had a disability, that they sort of let go of some of the dreams around what this child's life was going to be like. And so sometimes parents will say to me, and now you're asking me to bring that back up. You're bringing all this back up again. And I kind of let that go a long time ago. So that can be really difficult as well and different for the parents of a child with a disability. So let's just take a minute. I don't know if there's any, at this point, we're just going to take a little break and see if there's any questions you have. And I'm going to move on to tips and show you a tool for answering questions as well. So Sarah, if you see any particular questions coming in.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a couple.
Yeah, go ahead.
A couple so far. The first question we have is how or when does a parent make a decision that it would be better for their son to have a vasectomy? My son is a very handsome man, and I'm afraid a female will take advantage of him. Wouldn't it be a good thing if that female got pregnant? I think those are the concerns this person was sharing.
Yeah, sure. I don't think you're alone in that. I think a lot of people have those concerns, and I've had many conversations around that. I think the important thing is opening up the lines of communication and having these conversations with your son. We do have a history of people with disabilities being sterilized against their will, and so I think the more we can talk about it and help our children come to those decisions themselves, that's the way to do it. And so I don't know if you've had conversations with your son, but I would start talking about, does he know about reproduction and how babies are made and all of those things, and find out, does he want to be a father someday? Why or why not? And oftentimes people come to the conclusion themselves that they want to have a vasectomy or not. And if not, then how can you protect yourself from sexually transmitted diseases and contraception? So I think, probably most of my answers are going to be talk about it. Talk about your concerns and help them explore what they want to do.
Thank you. Another question, someone would like you to please address the precocious puberty that can occur for many young people who have neurological conditions like hydrocephalus.
Okay. So I'm not familiar with that as much, the specific condition, but you're talking about someone that might have, might be very sexual, it sounds like, is what you're saying. And, you know, I think, again, it's, and if this is your son or daughter, it's having those conversations about, you know, what could happen? What's the good side about this, and what's the downside about this? And exploring that. You know, the other thing that you might be worried about is, you know, somebody being taken advantage of. And sometimes it's really having those conversations about how do you know somebody really cares about you or not. And so sometimes it's hard conversations. Yeah, so maybe that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. And as far as social cues, how do you teach your kids to understand social cues better?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on the student, but doing a lot around, you know, looking at different pictures and what emotion might be attached to that picture. So some of that body language that was mentioned earlier would be one way. I know that a lot of people use social stories with students with autism as a way to teach some of those cues as well. So I think the more we can teach that, the better, but it's hard to be so concrete around things that are so subtle. So I think a lot of pictures help. One thing that was mentioned earlier is that I wrote a curriculum, and I have these different pictures that you can use around people's expressions and that kind of thing. So I think the more visuals you can find, the better. Like looking at this person, what do you think their emotion is? And teaching that.
Okay, we have quite a few questions. Did you want to take one more at this break and then maybe save some more for the end? How are you feeling?
That sounds great, yes.
How can I help an individual I support professionally advocate for themselves sexually to their guardian?
Okay, yeah. So, you know, I had this one person who had a disability, and they wanted to advocate for a relationship. And I think part of it is that the parent was thinking about sexuality in that way that we were talking about earlier, that it just meant sex. And this young person with a developmental disability said, you know, Mom, I really want to fall in love. And then the mom was like, oh, of course you do. So I think talking to the parent about what they really want and why they want a relationship, what's important to them, as a way to advocate. Because I think, you know, we know parents worry, and parents of kids with disabilities might worry even more. And so how could the person with a disability advocate and address the concerns the parent might have?
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few, as I mentioned, so maybe we can take some more at the end, and then any others that don't get addressed, I will be sure to send your way.
Okay, that sounds good. And I know this is so tricky because I am only getting a little bit of the story, and so the other piece is I'm leaving you my email address, so if you have questions afterwards, please email me and I'll respond to you as well. So
perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to just a few tips and a tool, and then we'll go back to some of the questions. But a lot of what we've talked about so far is these positive messages. Like, how can I give positive messages? But another thing is you don't have to know all the answers. It's okay to say, I don't know, and look it up. But make sure you go back and follow up. It's okay to feel embarrassed and to talk about that. You know, nobody talked to me about this, so I'm a little uncomfortable, but your questions are really good, or your comments are really interesting. You know, sort of validate that it's okay to talk about it, and when we talked earlier about messages, there were many, many people who said, don't talk about it was the message. So really our piece in this as parents is to try to make them as comfortable as possible so they know they can talk about it. It's okay to answer the question later. I mentioned already, tell your kids your values. Be very concrete, as I know you're all really aware of that, and use repetition. And there was one agency, a developmental disability agency, that used use the media. So, people did mention media messages are the same for people with disabilities and people without. But it's not going to go anywhere. So using the media, and this agency had a soap opera support group. They'd watch a soap opera together, and then they would talk about it after, like, well, how did you feel about how he treated her? Or what'd you think about that? And use the media as a way to talk about relationships and sexuality. So those are some tips. And then the other tip is using something called teachable moments. And you may have heard of that before. Oh, and this is the other thing, is instead of reacting, and this is what I tell parents all the time, don't react, respond, right? So your child has a question or they're doing some sort of sexual behavior, rather than reacting, try to respond. So that's another tip. And then the last piece is these teachable moments. And you may have seen one of these models before, but I think they're really helpful. Well, and first of all, this is if you're asked a question, and sometimes kids don't ask. Kids are really different. So some have a million questions and some ask nothing. So sometimes you have to initiate. But if you do get a question, then you can use this model. You can say, that's a really good question. And I always say that it gives you a little bit of stall time too. If a kid asks you a question like, I was on the bus and somebody called me a boner. What is a boner? You can say, that's a really good question. And it gives you a little bit of time to get your thoughts in order about how you're going to respond too. So and you're also giving that message, that great question. The next thing you want to do is find out what the child or the person thinks or is really asking. So what do you think it is a question. And then you can find out what they think it is. And that gives you a little more of a sense of what direction to go in or not go in. And you may have heard that joke about a child asked their mom, where did I come from? And the mom goes into this whole story about the sperm and the egg and intercourse and all these things. And then the kid says, oh, that's funny because Susie's from Los Angeles. And so, this idea that you might not have the right question. So saying, well, where do you think you came from? And they said, oh, I came from San Francisco. And you say, that's right, that's exactly where you came from, rather than going into the sperm and the egg. So it makes you, a little more of a needs assessment, so you're sure what direction and what the question really is. The next piece, decide what messages you want to give. And I'm just going to keep bringing that up. And then you're going to answer the question simply using correct vocabulary. Now, a couple things when working with or talking with our children with disabilities is it's often recommended that when we answer a question, we think about three aspects: the physical aspect, the emotional aspect, and the social aspect. So physical is really, what is it? So if we use the example of, and I always use the what is a boner as a good question to talk about, we could say it's when a penis gets hard and sticks out away from the body. That's the physical aspect. The social aspects are more about laws and responsibility and privacy. So somebody might say, and it's also a nickname for something called an erection. And if you have an erection in public, they're actually supposed to be for private. So here are some things you can do if you happen to this happens to you in public. And it can feel embarrassing if it happens in public. So that's that emotional aspect piece as well. So thinking about how you're going to respond, and physical, emotional, and social. And lots of times with kids with disabilities and grown kids with disabilities, it's talking about privacy as well. And then you're going to encourage the person to give you feedback. So that's sort of a, gives you a little bit of just sort of a tool to use. And Sarah mentioned she's going to post these PowerPoints so you can copy this off and practice it with your own children in the future. Okay, so I think, all right, yeah, so why don't we finish up some questions, and then I have a couple things to tell you about at the end.
Perfect. Yeah, hi, thank you.
Yeah.
A couple of questions have come in regarding abuse and trauma. How does law enforcement deal with inappropriate sexual actions? And kind of another question along those lines, how have you addressed sexual trauma among this population and I guess the community understanding?
Yeah. Okay. So as far as law enforcement, I would say it's probably different depending on where you are. And I know that there are some people who really specialize in how do you interview people with disabilities when they're talking about abuse. So I'm not as involved in that realm. And most of my work is more around sexuality education, but some tips I would give are things like telling your children the correct terminology for their body parts, right? So that's a really important one. So that if anything were to happen, they would have the language to be able to talk about it. I also believe that because people with disabilities are more vulnerable, people are targeting them more, and that if they're empowered and have lots of language and know their bodies and that kind of thing, they appear less vulnerable. And someone who is an abuser is looking for vulnerability. So I think having the language, knowing about body parts, knowing about consent is another really important topic as well. So I don't know as much about the legal issues, but that might be something you could find out from your local developmental disability agency to see how it's addressed. So I know there was one about legal, and then there was something else about, how do you teach people who have been abused, maybe? Was that it?
How do you deal with trauma in this population,
Yeah.
the developmental disability?
Yeah, so I mean, my experience is that when somebody has experienced some kind of trauma, that being really sensitive to that, of course, sometimes asking before you're going to show certain pictures and things like that help so that people don't feel like they're being re-victimized. So that's one thing that you can do. I also think you need in a lot of ways, you need a lot more sexuality education. If you've had that experience, you're now thinking that is what, you could potentially think that is what sexuality is now. And what it really is abuse, and knowing that difference and knowing how to identify it is important skills to have, and knowing about different relationships and what kind of a touch is okay within certain relationships. And you may have heard of the Circles program is one that's great around that, so that people really understand their space, and the next circle outside of them are close family and friends, and you can hug them, and then the space next to that are acquaintances, and we shake hands with them. And so sort of knowing like different types of relationships and how you touch is helpful, because then if someone who is not in your core group is touching your sexual parts, that might not be okay, right? That could be abuse. The other thing that can come up too is saying that sometimes someone will touch your sexual parts like a doctor to make sure that you're healthy. But in general, no one will touch your sexual parts unless you're ready for them to do that, or maybe a doctor to make sure that you're healthy. So I'm just trying to be really concrete about, that it's not, you can't just have a blanket statement saying no one will touch your sexual parts when a doctor might. So trying to think it through.
Mm-hmm. What would you suggest to do when the teen or adult is nonverbal and doesn't have the capacity to understand what parents talk about when sex with them because of their mental capacity?
Yeah, I know that's such a tricky one. I mean, I think my experience has been in my classes is that I try to simplify as much as possible, and I, you know, I think also figuring out, well, how do you communicate with this child in general? What works, what doesn't work, and then how can you do it around sexuality? And I know there are some resources for nonverbal children around sexuality, like some pictures and things that can be used. Yeah, so I think you got to do the best you can, and yeah, and really try do the best you can, be concrete, and think about what's worked in the past.
Great. Did you want to take a couple more or continue with the presentation?
What time do we have? Yeah, I'll take a couple more. And then I know you had sent me some comments, and I was just going to comment on a couple things as well. So, yeah.
Okay, perfect. We'll do a couple more.
Okay.
So what is an appropriate age to place a child with disabilities on birth control?
Yeah, so, you know, I guess there's two parts to this. One is, you know, are they in a relationship? Are they sexually active is sort of one question. And then sometimes people want to do it ahead of time because they're worried about abuse. You know, really, it really just depends on the child and whether they're in a relationship or not, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't say there's a specific age. It's more what's going on in their lives and do they need this kind of protection. Some people will suggest that a female go on Depo-Provera because they don't have their period and for different hygiene reasons. And so that sometimes comes up around another reason, might be around hygiene and managing your period and that sort of thing. But not so much about age, but more about the child's disability and what they might need.
Great. And then the last question we'll address right now is a specific question. They write, my 12-year-old with Down syndrome keeps talking about the day she'll grow up. She thinks that'll be next year and have a baby. How and when do I explain to her how unlikely that will be? Right now, we're just working on the idea of you're still only a kid, but eventually she'll need to know how unlikely this will really be.
Yeah. So yeah, that's hard. You know, it's like, do you want to give false hope? But I would spend some time, you know, one of the things we often do with kids with disability, well, any kid really, we say you're too young, or you're just gonna have to wait till you grow up, or, but what I would suggest doing is to really say, what makes you want to have a child? What's exciting to you to think about having a child? Because then they can talk about it and you can find out what it is really underneath that statement. I'll have something to love me. That's what girls do. What's underneath it and what excites them? And then ask, what worries you about having a child? Would be sort of the next thing. So you kind of go there with them. And I think as parents, we get worried about that. We worry if we go there in some way, there's some way we're encouraging it. But I think it gives us more information about what the child's thinking and why they want this in their lives. And then you can explore some of the scary parts or the concerns because you've aligned with them. And it shows that you're there and you're open. One of the things that there was a study done where I think it was in Australia, and they talked with teenagers about, do you talk to your parents about sexuality or not? And the ones that said that they did, many of them used the word open, even though the researchers didn't ask, are your parents open? But people would ask, young people would say, my parent, well, the reason I talk to them is they're just really open. So I think the more open we can be, the better about these conversations. That's what I would, sort of an aside there, would suggest as far as talking with our kids, is being open. The name of this study was Being Open with Your Mouth Shut. So really about listening and exploring versus, mini lectures on not being able to have a baby.
Great. And just quickly, do you have these materials available in Spanish, or can we send that out after? We have had a few questions about that.
Yeah, I don't have the PowerPoint in Spanish, but I have a curriculum that has handouts, and I have Spanish handouts, which were translated by someone in Connecticut, and then they gave them to me to give back to other people. So if you go to my website, we do have Spanish handouts that go with the curriculum, but not this PowerPoint.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so let me sort of just wrap up a couple more things here. There were a few people were talking about, well, I had a few comments. One was about multiple marginalized identities, and I think we talked about some of that around gender identity and sexual orientation as being considered marginalized identities. There is a lot of information out there right now about people with autism and gender dysphoria, so having some gender identity issues and seeing a lot of overlap, that there's a higher rate of people with autism that have these gender dysphoria issues. And I'm going to be writing about that. I do a newsletter every couple of weeks. I send out some information about the topic of sexuality and developmental disability. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my next one. And as you can see on the slide, if you're interested in getting your email on that list, you can click on the link. You'll have this PowerPoint. You can click on the link and leave your name. And I also have a report that I give out on staying safe on the internet for people with disabilities. So you can get that for free if you sign up. And then I'll just send something every couple of weeks or weekly, depending on what's going on. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing that you might be interested in is, and Sarah mentioned it, I've developed some online courses. And I did develop one for parents on talking with your kids about sexuality. Some of it is some of what we talked about today, but it also goes into how do you deal with behaviors, how do you tell your values, how do you give more detail on giving positive messages. And we decided to offer it at a discount for anyone on the webinar. If you have any interest, we did it 25% off. If you're a parent, there's one version. It's the same version, but we have a different price. So parents, if someone wants one, it's $35.25 instead of $47. Or the agency version's been marked down from $97 to $75.25. So an agency could buy this course and then offer it to all of their parents. It's an unlimited use. It's not like a one-time thing. So if that's a resource you'd want for parents, that's available. And then the last thing I wanted to say is this is my website and my email. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond through email. There were a few comments before the webinar about some school districts that were trying to develop a sexuality education curriculum. And I would suggest that you go to my website, because I have an agency edition and a school edition, and it's a 20-lesson curriculum. And it has a manual on how to be a good sexuality educator, and so there's a lot in there for teachers. There's also teaching tools and handouts available with that as well. So that might be something that some of you are interested in.
Katherine, someone asked regarding your curriculum, do you have a preview of that people can view before purchasing?
Yes. So if you go to my website and you go to the curriculum page, there's a table of contents, and then there's also a sample lesson plan just to sort of give you the sense of the flavor or whatever of the curriculum, what it looks like. It's actually designed for people with disabilities to team teach with a staff person. And so it's very well scripted as well. And what I found is that helps lots of people, not just someone with a disability, but just we we're in a culture that doesn't talk about this. And many times parents will say to me, can you just say it so I can hear what a normal conversation sounds like? Because we really don't have that experience in this culture. And let me get rid of this. We don't have that experience in our culture. And so we just like, what does it sound like to have a normal, healthy conversation? So I think that's pretty much what we need, is to try having these conversations, and it's okay not to be perfect. Do the best you can, and slow and steady wins the race.
Great. Thank you so much for addressing all those questions and your wonderful presentation today. There were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, so I will send those over to you along with the individuals' emails, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
And then, as Katherine mentioned, she shared her email and her website, so you can contact her there with any further questions, or email Family Voices if you have any additional questions. And I'd like to remind everyone that we do send out a survey for evaluating today's presentation, and we'd really love if you could take the time to provide some feedback. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending our webinar today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.